Well, hello, Charlie and Marianne. Thank you for this short interview about your work and about you. Um, First of all, I would like you to present yourself. Maybe some people they haven't seen the movie yet. So, but more than the movie, who are you?
Okay, cool. Shall I give a start and then you can converge? Well, my name is Charlie Shread, and I've trained as a filmmaker, so that's my sort of background as a video editor and videographer, filmmaker. And along my sort of journey of filmmaking, I started making films about education a little bit. And yeah, I mean, on that journey, I met you, and we sort of combined our passion of education and mixed with this sort of filmmaking. So,
yeah. So my name is Marianne Osorio. I'm from Brazil, and I'm trained as a biologist and educator. So I used to be a science teacher in state schools here in Brazil. And then I went to the UK to do a master in education. And I met Charlie, and we discovered this common passion around democratic education, especially. And in 2015, we discovered sociocracy through James Priest from Sociocracy 3.0. And as we were visiting many democratic schools, and most of them were using majority rule to make decisions with the kids, we start questioning, are there any alternatives to majority rule? Because we've seen quite often polarization, exclusion of minorities, segregation, and also quite often the majority of kids will propose kind of punishments to solve the issues, and we were wondering, is there an alternative? And when we discover sociocracy, we wondered, are there any schools in the world that use sociocracy for their governance? So in 2017, we started researching about this, and we knew that sociocracy as a method of governance started in the Netherlands by Shread. So we researched specifically in the Netherlands for this kind of schools, and we found out that there were a few, So we got in touch with them, and they opened the doors to us. So we found those six democratic schools in the Netherlands using sociocracy, and that's how we created the School Circles film. So that's our main project. It is part of our wider project called Wandering School, which is a research project into what we call liberating education, especially based on Paulo Freire's ideas. And that includes democratic education as well, democratic governance involving the children in decision-making. So yeah, we just followed that path and made this film, and it was published in 2018. Yeah.
If we give a little bit of context how the film sort of fits into our journey. So we actually we got together as a couple about 6.5 years ago, and the very beginning of our relationship was actually visiting schools. So that was our romantic connection. So we said, would you like to visit some schools together? We were like, yeah, go on, let's go on a trip. And we'd already been visiting some different progressive schools before, before we kind of met. And this kind of sparked our Wandering School project, really, this kind of desire to learn from different educational practices. So we started visiting many different schools, and then this evolved into Wandering School. So then we started recording some of our journey and experiences and spreading the sort of lessons that we learned along the way. And we wanted to sort of formalize this into a bigger project of sharing inspiration and expanding the discussion about what's the point of school and what is a liberating education and this kind of thing. And so the School Circles film kind of evolved out of this process of searching.
Yeah, and that led us to go deeper into sociocracy as well. So I think it was 2018 when we were still editing the film. We did a training on sociocracy with John Burke from the US and Edwin John from India. And from that point, we start diving deeper into the practice of sociocracy. And so currently, we also support schools and educators to implement sociocracy in their educational contexts. So that is our current work at the moment. And we also talk with many schools, universities, communities around the film, about the film. So we're doing a lot of conversations around the film as well. So that's where we are at the moment.
I have a list of different questions, and you have answered a lot of them. But
cool.
I think it's really interesting about what you told us, that you started with Sociocracy 3.0 with James Priest, and then you went into the circular design model, Sociocratic model, that is more like the traditional model. And we know that there are others like model or branches about sociocracy, like holacracy of Brian Robertson. Have you discovered, have you find schools that use different branches of sociocracy, or mostly they are like the traditional circular design model?
Yeah, great question. So actually there's quite a bit of diversity in the schools, but they generally, most of the schools in the Netherlands specifically, they've been introduced to sociocracy from a woman who started an organization called the Consent Method. And she doesn't actually use the term sociocracy, but she's adapted the decision-making process for a more kind of simplified version, especially for families and for children. And this has been the main sort of method that's been used in the schools. And they kind of don't use the double links. They don't focus so much on the whole organization structure. They focus more on just the decision-making moment, which uses the same basic pattern of like picture forming, proposal shaping, and consent decision. So that three core pattern of decision making is still there, but it's simplified. In one school in our film, for those who've seen it, we concentrate on the school towards the end that uses the double links and connects the different circles together. They didn't learn sociocracy from the consent method. They learned it through the Sociocratic Center in the Netherlands, or through someone who studied from there. So they have a more like traditional, the classic sociocracy approach. Interestingly, there's at least one other school that had a holacracy coach as one of the parents, and she introduced holacracy to the staff. So there's a couple of schools that used holacracy with the staff and sociocracy within the school with the students. So it was interesting because they found that the holacracy was kind of an efficient way to identify the roles and a fairly kind of speedy way to work with the staff, but it didn't translate so well with a kind of a governance model with the kids where you're trying to get policies from a larger group of people. So it was interesting, that combination of different branches. Have you add anything?
No, yeah, I just want to say that when we had the first contact with Sociocracy 3.0, the impression that we had was that the classic sociocracy or the circle method had died out. I don't know, that was the impression that we got, and that the current sociocracy system is the Sociocracy 3.0. So it was actually through Sociocracy for All, when we started getting involved with the school circle in Sociocracy for All, that Ted told us that Shread Edinburgh's still alive, and maybe we should visit him and talk to him. And we were like, what? We didn't know. So it was thanks to that hint from Ted that we messaged the Sociocratic Centrum in the Netherlands and asked to interview Shread and Anna Vick. So that was nice because they offer the theory and the basis of the sociocratic circle method. Yeah. And we in the film we merged that, we combined that with the practice in the schools. So yeah, we try to unite those two perspectives. But the schools quite interesting. Some of them also didn't know about Shread, even though they're in the Netherlands and they were practicing sociocracy. They were not familiar with Shread's ideas as well. So yes, Charlie said some of them learned through Bowdy wishes from the consent method, and yeah, one school learned from the Sociocratic Centrum, like a consultant from that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Sorry, we mapped many schools, but we still don't know in many details how a lot of them work. So we're talking about the 6 schools that we focus on in the School Circles film, but there is a diversity of schools out there that we mapped, and we don't know in detail how they work really.
Well, it's really impressive when you interviewed Shread Endenburg. It was like, wow, you are talking with him, and was impressing also what he said in your movie. But before going to the movie, I would like to ask you a little more about the intersection about education and sociocracy, and you told us a little about that you are working in this research about how the Pedagogía de la Liberación, Pedagogy of Liberation of Paulo Freire, connects with sociocracy. So can you tell us a little more about that connection, and maybe try to understand more your motivation, and what do you think about is what the sociocracy offers to the pedagogy?
Cool. Yeah, I can. So when I did my master in 2014-15, my focus was the pedagogy of Paulo Freire, and I analyzed two schools in Brazil, democratic schools, and I identified 4 main pillars in the ideas of Freire. And the first is dialogue, the second is autonomy, the third is problematization, and the fourth is engagement with the world. So these are 4 main pillars that I identified, that I selected from loads of his ideas, and I did my analysis based on that. So especially in democratic schools, there is a big focus in the dialogue and autonomy. I think that's kind of common in all democratic schools, because they really focus in the development of the autonomy of the students, both in the decision making, the rules of the school, as in their own learning process. So these pillars, which is the democratic governance and the students' autonomy, these are 2 main characteristics present in all democratic schools, independently if they use majority rule or sociocracy. So we started investigating more democratic schools because we were interested in these 2 aspects, which relates to autonomy, and also with dialogue, because the decision-making process, it is a process of dialogue, is a process of, especially in sociocracy, we find that we listen to everyone, and we create this collective image together, listening from different perspectives, and that expands our view of the world, and takes us from our limiting perspectives sometimes, because quite often we have an idea, and then when we start listening to everyone in a circle, we expand that idea, and we're like, wow, I haven't thought about that. I haven't seen through that angle. And I think sociocracy is a great tool for dialogue, really, for building this collective understanding and consciousness of the world and the community. So yeah, I think these are the main connections, I think. Do you want to add anything?
Just to connect to that is like, yeah, when you're going in around and you're listening to each person, you might be fixed on a specific idea, but then by the time it gets to you, you might realize, oh, I've changed my mind. I actually really agree with what they said, or they brought a new perspective. So it's bringing this multiple perspectives together. Definitely connects with what can be called conscientization. So becoming more conscious of a situation, more conscious of an issue, for example, and this can bring a deeper understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's go to the movie. You told us a little about it, but I would like to ask you how the movie has changed your life.
That's a good question.
Oh,
It's changed it a lot, hasn't it?
yeah.
I mean, just in a personal level, before we started the movie, we were very ignorant, to be honest, about sociocracy specifically. We already discussed a lot about education things, but specifically sociocracy, we really didn't have a clue. We just had this short workshop with James Priest, and we were inspired by it. But we went there completely in kind of blind, really, and the project itself was a learning and a research for us to actually understand about sociocracy and understand how this works in practice. So it's completely changed our trajectory of the last 3 years, because sociocracy before that was just kind of an interest, a kind of a curious thing, and now it's kind of taken over our lives quite a lot. So that's in one way.
Yeah, yeah. Also, before we dive into the film, Wandering School was really like an embryo, because we were just exploring, and we were investigating as we could, and eventually making little films here and there. But it was only with School Circles that we actually like focused a lot of energy to develop a project, a solid project, and that led to our current work. So as Charlie said, from that point we investigated more sociocracy, we did trainings, we also visited the children's parliament in India to see how they use sociocracy in their communities. So yeah, from that point we start opening more to explore more sociocracy. I think at this point, we're also interested in expanding again and going back to our wider view of education and liberating education. But it's true that the film takes still most of our time and energy. So we are now, as I said, doing trainings on sociocracy for schools. We participate in talks about the film. So that really changed our work and our life, really.
And the process of making the film as well kind of completely changed our life, because obviously we spent a few months in the Netherlands, so just completely absorbed into the culture of those schools and getting to know people, and even living in one of the schools for some time as well. And then once we gathered all this footage and we became completely soaked and absorbed in that culture, we locked ourselves away and became hermits for an entire year while we were editing, and sometimes going a little bit mad, trying to figure out how to edit all of this. So it's funny how each phase is kind of a completely different way to it. So I, as a filmmaker, I'd never worked on such a big project. I'd always done little like promotional videos, like that kind of stuff. So I was completely out of my depth. And obviously you as well, having never made any big film or anything like that. So it was a huge learning experience. And yeah, it was tough as well to kind of go through nearly 200 hours worth of footage and figure out what to do with it, and then eventually put it into a finished piece.
Incredible. So what is the main impacts that the film has had? Can you tell us how it has moved other people or other impacts?
Cool. Well, so since we released the film, we've been receiving many messages and emails from, especially from progressive schools, saying, look, this film really inspired us to start practicing sociocracy. I think especially schools that are forming, there are a lot of alternative, progressive, democratic schools emerging. Some of them really small, a lot of them are also more community of homeschoolers and unschoolers. And they've been searching for a governance system. So the film gives them an idea, a proposal, and apparently a lot of people connect with it because they are looking for a more inclusive way of making decisions. Some of them also question and experience the majority rule and realize that that has some limitations. So yeah, we're receiving quite a lot of messages from people getting inspired from the film. And I think a lot of people after watching the film looked for some kind of training in sociocracy. Also, some of them maybe already knew about it and went deep afterwards. And some of them, I think, they feel like they're ready to start practicing just after watching the film, which is good, I think, because the film, it is in itself a short training, I think, because it shows like the main principles, it shows the practice, how to conduct the meetings. So I think a lot of people after watching the film felt confident and inspired to start practicing. So we've seen that happening a lot. And it was cool because we start offering a license for public exhibitions of the film as well. And then we had the contacts of many universities, many schools that started investigating sociocracy from that point onwards. So the film opened this door for many organizations and communities.
It's really nice to see the film being used, like especially like universities and communities, where previously they wouldn't have had any contact with either even democratic education or sociocracy or other like progressive forms of education. So it's I really like to see that it's opening up a dialogue, even if people don't necessarily want to use sociocracy or want to use unschooling pedagogy or anything like that. But at least it's kind of like helping to expand this dialogue of what is possible and seeing actual case studies of how it works. Like, yeah, I like that our film is kind of practical, that you can actually see things, see it in practice, which a lot of kind of films about progressive education are a bit more philosophical and not so practical. So I like that you can actually see it, and that helps to open dialogue in a bit more depth.
Can you tell me some beautiful stories that you have find in circular schools that for you is the most beautiful?
I'm trying to think of a specific example. We often use like the candy floss machine as an example.
Yeah,
like,
I like it.
of the process working, don't we?
Yeah, I think one thing I want to say that inspired me was in Vrairemta, which is the school we focus at the end of the film. It's really cool that they have a student in the board of directors. So I think for me that was like a wow, because it's really rare to see that. Like very often the board of directors is a closed, it happens in a closed room, no one knows much what's going on, and it's usually adult dominant. And it's really nice to see. It was really nice to see a student there and representing the whole students and participating in big decisions involving like legal stuff. So I thought that was really inspiring.
I also find it inspiring, this is also another democratic school as well, but the fact that the kids themselves are given the chance to facilitate meetings and like lead the decision-making process. So as well as being participants, they can also be the leaders in that. And that really helps to understand like a democratic process of involving everyone. And just that whole thing is really inspiring to me, yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think we really show, I think in the film we show the parts that really caught our attention, and we wanted to promote to the world. So the episode of the candy floss machine, it's also on YouTube for free for who wants to watch it. It's really nice because it shows like how the kids, they really empower themselves. And so yeah, there's this kid who the group of kids who wanted a candy floss machine in the school party, and it costs 60 euros. And then we hear all the students giving their opinions, like
someone saying candy floss is not healthy, kids should not be eating so much, and then so someone else brings an alternative idea, or maybe we should limit it just to one candy floss and they can have other healthy treats as well.
yeah. So they share their opinions and their ideas, and that shapes a more elaborated proposal that everyone can consent with. And I thought that was a beautiful process to see, how they build that together. And at the end they celebrate, like, yeah, we made a decision, and it's really cool. It's really inspiring.
Yeah, it's a really like child-led decision as well, because like a candy floss machine is such a like a sort of innocent child's idea, isn't it? We want a candy floss machine, like, and they came out with a really mature process in the end, like figuring out how to actually get some money back from it by selling it for a small price, and then being able to use that for other things, and how to make it so people have healthy treats as well, so that it's not unhealthy and this kind of stuff. So it's great to see, like, starting from this kind of naive beginning of a candy floss machine actually developed into a mature process.
It's an impressive experience, that history, and I agree that the children in the school board was like, wow, it is possible. So what would you say that is are the key elements of sociocratic schools? Because you have democratic schools, and you have schools, or maybe you have liberated schools, but what would you say that are the key elements when we can start saying this is a sociocratic school?
Oh, that's a difficult question.
Yeah, I mean, just to start, firstly, there's kind of two, as Mai already mentioned briefly, there's two core pillars to any school from our perspective. One is the governance and one is the pedagogy. So the governance side of things can be done in several different ways. We categorize it broadly as either authoritarian or democratic. So authoritarian is a very standard way of doing it. You have a boss or a head teacher, and you have your hierarchy of roles, like your head of departments or whatever. That's the standard way that most people know. And then there's the democratic way of doing it, which breaks that down and has a kind of more flat hierarchy. So the democratic way of doing things can be broken down into a few different methods as well. So you can use a majority rule as your main way of making decisions, or you can use a consensus, which has diverse approaches as well, or you can use sociocracy. So within that, you can say, like, as soon as the governance of the school is using sociocracy, or any of the pillars of sociocracy, then it is sociocratic, or in the process of becoming sociocratic. So that's the governance side. On the side of the pedagogy, there isn't really anything specifically that says this is a sociocratic pedagogy. So in terms of the pedagogy, we have different terms, for example, humanistic or constructivist or traditional pedagogies. So actually you can use any one of those types of pedagogies and more, and still use sociocracy. So for example, if you've heard of Rudolf Steiner, for example, or Maria Montessori, these types of schools could use sociocracy as well. So they could have the pedagogy of Steiner with all of the details of Steiner, but add a sociocratic way of making decisions as well. So you can have a sociocratic Steiner school, or you could have a sociocratic traditional state school as well. Would you like to?
Yeah, no, so when we talk about sociocracy, we talk about the governance. So that can, and I think quite often has an influence and impact in the pedagogy itself, because quite often when we are thinking about giving students autonomy and power for decision making in the school, we also giving them power to guide their own learning. So there is this bridge, you know. So I think it's nice to look for coherence, and when you're trying to democratize the governance, you're also trying to democratize the pedagogy. So I think that's why a lot of democratic schools are going to sociocracy now. But you can also have a traditional school, the traditional pedagogy, that uses sociocracy as a method of governance. For example, here in Brazil, by law, all the state schools should be democratic, and they should have a school council with representatives from the parents, teachers, administrators, and students. So it would be relatively simple to start implementing sociocracy in this school council. So it's possible. But I think it's not a very easy question to answer, because, for example, we know some schools that only use sociocracy with the staff, and then don't use sociocracy with the children. So they wouldn't be considered a democratic school, because democratic schools involve the students in the decision making. So would the schools be considered fully sociocratic? I don't know. There are some other schools, on the other hand, that use sociocracy with the students in the school circle, but don't use sociocracy with the staff for making decisions with the staff, and they still have a very hierarchical and top-down approach with the staff. So I don't think it's a very easy answer. We don't have a very clear answer on that. Even when we are mapping the schools, because we created a map of schools that use sociocracy in the world, we still struggle to create the categories. Like, how are we going to organize this? Because as I said, some use with the students, but use with the staff. Some use with the staff and not with the students. But I think the main aspect is using consent for making decisions collectively. And I think that's the first and the main step that all of these schools that use sociocracy have in common. They all using consent-based decision making in some kind of circle, perhaps just with the staff, or with the staff and students, or just with the students. So that's the main thing. And as Charlie already mentioned, a lot of them don't actually use the double link, which is one of the 4 principles of the sociocratic method. A lot of them don't use double link, and so that principle, it's quite often neglected, or the schools choose to not implement that. But at least the consent decision making and circle, some kind of circle, they have that. And most of them, from what we know, also use the sociocratic election, at least to elect the facilitator of the circle and the administrator. So yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, wow. Those are really useful distinctions. What do you think about the social commitment? I didn't get if you went to India to meet you were there to meet the children parliaments. But do you think that maybe that is a third dimension, the commitment of the school with the society, with the social problems? This is more a theoretical question, but also, have you seen some schools that are like combining both? I mean, the 3 of the dimensions, the organization, the pedagogy, and the social commitment?
That's fascinating. Yeah, to be honest, the schools that we filmed in the Netherlands, well, firstly, just to clarify, so there's the Children's Parliament, as you mentioned, in India. So they're using the sociocratic method to some extent, so the children can actually influence their their local community and actually improve their neighborhoods and their villages. And so they've used it, for example, to bring electricity or water to their village where there were some houses that didn't have access. And so that's one context in India, and the Children's Parliament is very successful for making those kind of changes. And then if we change context back to the Netherlands, which is a very technologically developed country, so there wouldn't necessarily be the same issue on the streets. So there wouldn't be like a lack of electricity, for example. There might be other issues. But so in this context, so with these sociocratic schools that we filmed, there isn't this sense of going out to the community or connecting with the wider world much. It's very internal. So it's an insular internal activity. So it is a great question you asked about, like, is there any examples doing both? So I see it as like this internal and external approach of like connecting from the democratic or sociocratic internal governance and affecting the wider community as well.
Yeah. So I just want to add to what Charlie's saying. So remember those 4 pillars from the liberating education. One of them is the problematization, which help us to question the reality and the status quo. And the other one is the engagement with the world, which is about going out of only the school building and engaging and transforming the world around us. So these 2 points we were actually missing when we visited the many schools in the Netherlands, but also in Europe. We realized that those 2 pillars were missing quite often, and that's what drove us to go to India, because there, otherwise, they really focus on those 2 principles in the Children's Parliament, and they were practicing in the communities, not much in the school. What was interesting when we went to the schools, because there are some schools that are using developing the Children's Parliament in the school, and then when we realized that in the school it's not as radical as it is in the communities, because there's still a lot of the teachers telling kids what to do and restricting what they could implement and within the school. So it's very different, because the schools were less democratic than the ones we've seen in the Netherlands, but the parliaments happening on the streets and the villages were really radical. And the film Power to the Children from Anna Kirsting really shows that the most beautiful thing about the Children's Parliament. And I think there is a school that I talked about in my master. Is a democratic school here in Brazil called Politeia. They don't use sociocracy, but they are really trying hard to implement Paulo Freire's ideas. And in my dissertation, I talk about these 4 pillars, including engagement with the world and problematization, how this school managed to develop and apply those principles. So it's on our website for anyone to read as well, if you want to dive into that.
The schools certainly could use sociocracy as a basis for engaging with the wider community and the wider world, and also problematizing the local and global issues and using that process to actually make a positive difference to the world. But yeah, as Mari said, there's kind of like some that do the external engagement with the world and some that do the internal democratization internally, but there's very little of both happening that we've seen so far.
Yeah.
There's a challenge for our future. So yeah. I'd like to ask you, when a new school director connect with you and they ask you advice about what are the steps to become a sociocratic school, what do you answer? I mean, what are the steps to I mean, first you have to do this and that, and until you get to be a sociocratic school.
Well, there's no like predefined package of steps, to be honest, because each context is different. So I mean, we would say something quite different to someone who's working in a traditional state school compared to a small group of people who are starting their own school. So it's easier to say for people who are starting their own school, if it's a group of parents, for example, or a small group of families, then the first step is really to just do training in sociocracy, to understand the main principles and actually learn how to facilitate a sociocratic meeting. And then right from the beginning, as you're defining the school, you're using sociocracy to define and shape the school from the beginning. So that's kind of an easier response for people who are beginning to start their own small independent schools. But for a larger or more established, especially traditional school, it's a lot more complicated. I mean, the first step might be to obviously introduce the teachers or a few teachers who are interested in trying to bring it first to the classroom. And then depending on the school, there's a whole, many different ways it could be done, right?
Yeah, I that's a very good question and a very difficult one to answer as well, because yes, Charlie said there is no single path and each school is really different and they have different needs, different contexts. Like with the school that we've been working with in Spain, they starting with a very small group of children and they wanted to introduce sociocracy to this group of children, and they were asking how can we do that, because they're not even used to listen to each other very well. And so we said, well, just start with rounds. So sometimes it's something really simple, like start using rounds to listen to everyone, especially with kids, and having a talking stick really helps. Hope, who's also in sociocracy for all, she wrote a very lovely article about that, how to implement sociocracy with children. So yeah, sometimes having a talking stick, listen to everyone in a round is the first step, so people can get to know, like start listening to each other with attention, so that's really simple. But as Charlie said, for example, in a state school, and I worked in a state school as a science teacher, but I was, and I had gladly the autonomy to do assemblies, or how we call meetings, democratic meetings with the students in my classroom. So as a teacher, I could start implementing democratic decision making or sociocracy with the classroom, and we could elect representatives from the classroom to go to the student council. And Lisa Prague, she also wrote about the election of representatives, class representatives using sociocracy in schools in Austria. And so you could start with that, using sociocratic elections to elect representatives, using sociocracy in the student council, and then in the teachers' meetings, start implementing sociocracy in the teachers' meetings. And then if you have, or you could build a school council and start using sociocracy in the school council with representatives from the students, parents, teachers, admin, staff. So I don't actually think it's necessarily more difficult in state schools. I think the difficulty is to implement the change, because quite often we wonder, how can we change the system? Quite often it has to come from top down. Maybe you have to convince the head teacher that that's a good approach, and I don't know, that is the challenge. But a lot of schools, they're also starting from scratch. They're also struggling because quite often there is the founders syndrome as well. The founders, and I don't have the answer, like how the founders, they want to implement their dream and their ideas, but they also want to listen to the other staff and build the community from scratch with the staff. But then there is always this dynamic of power, how much we decide together, how much I make the decisions, or the head teacher makes the decisions. And I think every school is facing different challenges and going through different journeys. I don't know, Seba, do you have any answers to that?
Well, you have to interview me. No, I'm not that interesting as you. I have two more questions. The first one is, how would you invite children to be part of sociocracy? What would you say to them? I mean, I think sociocracy is really like rational a lot of times, but how do you invite, how you commit, how do you engage a little kid to be part of this? What would you say to him or to her?
Well, in all of the schools, for example, the kids just learn through experience. So I mean, it helps if you've already established a culture of, you know, listening to rounds, and then a new kid can obviously join and then just see what everyone else is doing. But if you're starting from scratch, I guess it's a bit more difficult because you have to kind of like establish that culture first to introduce new people too, don't you? So, I mean, the first thing is we're not introducing to kids like, here's the concept of sociocracy and give them a whole presentation about it. It's just saying, okay, we need to decide something. Let's listen to everybody in a round. So just be quiet until it's your turn to speak. So make sure we listen to everyone. And then we say, well, do you have any questions? Do you understand it? And then, you know, they can answer that. Okay, maybe, did you think about this? They might have a question. And then we listen to everyone to give their questions. And then we say, has everyone understood it now? Yeah, okay. And then we say, all right, so do you have any opinions about it or ideas of how to improve this proposal? And then we listen to everyone again, or maybe we do some brainstorming, or maybe we use some post-it notes or whatever to try and improve this idea. And then once we've got this idea together, then we can ask everyone for their consent. So it's quite a natural process just by asking a simple question each time, like, do you have ideas? Are you all right with this? Can you give a thumbs up? Or, I mean, to introduce the idea of consent might take more practice as well to understand objections to consent. But young kids can definitely get it, and they do get it. And if you watch our film, you can see many kids talking very eloquently and articulately about like what is an objection and what is consent.
Yeah, I want to say that currently we're working in online school for homeschoolers called Galileo. And in the school we're going to start now in October, we're offering a course to the students on sociocracy. And we were wondering, how do we market this to kids? How do we make that interesting? The course in the platform is called Democratic Decision Making, because we wanted to, you know, highlight that sociocracy is still a way of achieving democracy in our view. So, and it's a word that people can relate more, you know. So, and our initial phrase that we put there is, do you want to have a voice in decisions that affect you? So I think that was, when we got to that question, I was happy with it, because I think everyone wants to have a voice in the question, in the decisions that affect them, and that for me is the essence. So for me, sociocracy is about, yeah, making sure that everyone is being heard and included in the decisions that affect them. So I think the kids are craving for that, and they want to be heard. So when you start, I think initially you need an adult to facilitate the process before you pass the stick to the kids to do this role. But when the adult facilitates, you know, you can take the kids in the journey, and they start through practice, as Charlie said, and experience, they start getting the process and understanding how it works and feeling more comfortable. And I think one point that it's important to focus on is helping the kids, and not just the kids, the adults, and sometimes it's even more difficult with adults to identify objections and distinguish objections and tolerance and preference, because quite often we are really stuck with our preference, and I want this to happen because that's my preference. And in sociocracy, we ask people, you know, is this good enough for now, safe enough to try? Maybe it's not your preference, but can you live with it? Is within your area of tolerance? And I think that's a difficult work for most of us. And so that's, for me, the beginning for people to be able to implement sociocracy and do consent decision making, to be able to feel their bodies, identify their objections and tensions, and to be able to verbalize their needs. And so I think that's the beginning of the work. Yeah.
I think another challenge also is to is to bring in sort of evidence and arguments as opposed to just my opinion. So this is a difficult process as well, because it's very easy just to say, I have my opinion, this is my opinion, this is what I think, and trying to transition more to like a sort of scientific thinking, which is kind of goes back to the original philosophy of sociocracy, to try and bring a scientific approach to decision making. So bringing in evidence and arguments and data, and there's in practice there's less of this with the kids, of course, but there's no reason why we can't try to bring in more of that kind of scientific way of thinking.
Yeah.
Did we answer your question, Seba? Are we going too far?
Of course, and we are running out of time, but I have a last question for you, if you can give us 2 minutes, a couple of minutes. This is the question that everybody is asking and would like to ask you. And it's nothing about you as a couple, it's about what is your next movie?
Oh God, yeah. We also wondering that. we filmed the children's parliament in India, so we went there with our equipment. We filmed, we collect loads of footage, and that was the end of 2018. So we have this footage since then, and we want to create this film about the children's parliament. But there are a few obstacles in the way. I think first is knowing that there's already a great film about it, and I don't think we're going to be able to make a film that that does justice better than Power to the Children. So I think that film it's focusing on the most beautiful aspect.
Yeah, it's already perfect.
It's perfect. We watched and we cried and we were like, oh my God, this is beautiful, and that's why we went there, to see in practice. But the footage that we collected was pretty focused on the interviews with the staff and people from NCN, the organization that starts implementing the parliaments in India. So we have a lot of interviews with the people. We have interviews with the kids. We have a few shots of the parliaments in practice. So I mean, we can still make something interesting out of it. But then the second obstacle is the crowdfunding campaign, because for school circles, we did a crowdfunding campaign to start the film. And it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, and it's difficult to actually get the funds to make the film. And we have a lot of work going on at the moment. So we're struggling to find the time, the resources, the motivation to do this film. But that is our next project, I guess.
Yeah. I guess we would probably make a shorter film, maybe 40 minutes, about the children's parliament. And it would be more kind of like a behind the scenes. So the Power to the Children film that Anna Kerstin made is a really like experiential, emotional side to it. But we'd probably go with more of like, this is how it works. This is how you could start your own kind of thing.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Charlie, Marianne, thank you for your motivation, your fire, your knowledge, your art. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you, Seba. It's a pleasure. Thank you for listening to us. And, I think you made very, very good questions, very difficult ones to answer. And now my brain is like reflecting a lot about this. Thank you.
It was an honor. Thank you very much. I will be waiting your next movie.
Cool.
A big hug.
See you,
Bye-bye.
Seba. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.